Okay, and this would be the second Zoom session of 240 for 2018 fall, and we're talking linear versus compression, as the course is called, 240 Compression and Digital Features. So last week we did told a whole pile of lies, all kinds of stuff, and I'll show you what we talked about over here. Maybe I can shrink this guy here, pull up our two notes here, and I'm going to pull up good old units right here. This was our notes covered last time, and we went through a whole topic last week about gain in dB versus output in dB/SPL. And that is something to be recalled really from 110 acoustics. So we won't go on anymore about that. Then we covered last week, we introduced ourselves to input-output functions, which was the language upon which linear gain and compression are described and explained on good old hearing aid specs. So basically we said that input-output functions always show, what do you call it, input on the horizontal and output along the vertical. So buttons and become a tailor. Where are we? Here we go. Here's an input-output function of a linear gain hearing aid. And input here on the horizontal, output here on the vertical, and of course the difference between the input and the output is of course the gain. We described and we went through how to basically read this. And let's describe this one thing where we finished off last week. And let's kind of go there again, but in a different graph. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to copy this stick right here. I'm going to go here, copy, and I'm going to paste. And here I am. I'm going to move it and slide that guy right there. Okay, so now you're looking at two linear gains. But let's look first of all at the left one. So let's move this guy over here. Let's look here. 0 in, 60 out. 20 in, 80 out. 40 in, 100 out. 60 in, 120 out. The gain was constantly 60. Now, when we move, what happens when we do this? All right. Now, 40 in is 80 out. What's the difference? 40. 60 in is 100 out. What's the difference? 40. 80 in is 120 out. What's the difference? 40. So all along this particular gain line, you have less gain. 40, 40, 40. Whereas over to the left, it's 60, 60, 60. And I guess the point I'm trying to drive home is, normally on graphs, when you think as you go to the right, you get more, and as you go up, you get more. True of the axes, but when you're looking at linear gain, when you move it left or right, if you move that linear gain line to the right, you've reduced your gain. And if you move the gain line to the left, you've increased your gain. Exactly back-asswards to what you'd think, but nonetheless, very important in terms of reading input-output functions. And I guess that's what I was trying to end last week on when we gave some examples that way. So again, the length of the line means nothing on input-output functions. Because look at this leftmost line. The gain is 60 here, it's 60 here, it's 60 here. So the length, I could go on up to the top of the screen and off of my computer. It doesn't matter. The point is going left and right. That's what changes gain. So basically, if we can take our PowerPoint then all the way more to the end, when you look at two different ways of reading what hearing aids are doing, this is a frequency response graph showing you what happens with the volume control at different positions, at 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Sure, frequency response graphs are easier. They're way more intuitive. I mean, you can just see it, okay? Input-output functions are a little different because when I'm looking here, you have to understand, oh, the frequency is 2,000 hertz. And as I go to the left, my gain is going up. And as I go to the right, my linear gain is going down. And here you can see the knee point, knee point, and knee point. The bend in the function, showing you now where you're either having linear gain to the right here, or else you're having compression. Who knows? Okay, but we'll talk way more about types of compression next week. But here's an example of a picture from a hearing aid spec sheet. Okay, again, this is showing you the maximum power output of a hearing aid in terms of frequency response, a much easier way in which to understand what's going on. Look at, if I turn my maximum power output down, or in terms of ANSI, my OSPL90, my output sound pressure level, if I turn that down, I'm around 110. You know, this is just off of some particular hearing aid, right? Just some hearing aid from some hearing aid company. And if I crank up the maximum power output, you can read it here. Okay, so you can see the gray area is showing you the range. But if you look at that in terms of an input-output function, here the frequency is understood to be 2000 hertz. So all you're talking about is what's happening here, just here. Okay, because that's the most important frequency for ANSI, is 2000 hertz. Okay, that's where vowels and consonants meet. That's why input-output functions, as seen on ANSI, are always representing 2000 hertz, unless otherwise specified. Anyway, here's the effect of MPO adjustment. Here's the effect of MPO adjustment. This one's talking Polish, this one's talking German, just different languages. Here you can see all the different frequencies, and here you're only looking at what's happening at 2000 hertz, but you're looking at the same hearing aid. Very same hearing aid, okay? And so they're showing you the maximum power output around 2000 hertz is going to be around 110. And I guess, okay, at 2000 hertz, it's going to be around 110, right there. Whereas if I increase the MPO, now at 2000 hertz, the maximum output is going to be around 120 plus. Here's 120, so almost 120. Almost 130, just about 130, because this is 120, that's 110, so 120 and 130. So we're almost at 130. Let's go to here. At 2000 hertz, you're almost at 130. You see? That's the point I'm trying to drive home. There's two different kinds of graphs that describe what hearing aids are doing. Gain and output are often shown on frequency responses, the more intuitive way. This is the one you're going to see the most often. But when you see this is a better way in which to show compression and what's happening at different input levels. And you can see the changes that occur with different input levels. And let's follow this line really carefully, because changing the maximum power output doesn't do anything for soft inputs, because the hearing aid isn't going to reach its maximum power output unless you've got a high input. Remember, input plus gain is output. So you're never going to reach your maximum power output, even with the volume cranked up full blast to give you maximum gain. If my input is 10 and my gain is 80, what's my output? 90. Well, that's not an MPO, that's low, okay? So nothing is going to happen with soft inputs. But it's starting to get, when you start to get to moderate level inputs, now the MPO adjustment has an effect. Whereas for soft inputs, there's nothing happening, there's no change, okay? So the gain, and all of a sudden the gain is lessened. All of a sudden it's held constant here. Okay, from 40 to about 85, 90, the gain is going to be held to be at an amount that's, well, let's look at what the gain was here. Let's figure it out. Okay, 0 in was about, if this is 60 and that's 70, 0 in was probably like 67 out. So that must be my gain, 67. Because 0 in was around 67 out. 10 in was around 77 out. Again, my gain of 67. 20 in equals about 97. Okay, so my gain is still going to be 67. All right, so and again, 30 in is about 97. There you go. 20 in is 87. 30 in is 97. So that my gain is linear. See how that 45-degree angle? It means that the gain hasn't changed. You're getting linear gain. It's tit for tat. For every 20 decibels of increase, I'm getting the 20 decibel output increase. So my input increases correspond directly with my output increases, or I should say the other way around. My output increases correspond completely with my input increases. Every single decibel of increased input results in a similar increase in output. So my gain is constant. In this case, it happens to be 67. So it's 67 for a 0 input. It's 67 for a 10 input. It's 67 for a 20 input. It's 67 for a 30. And finally, now when you get to 40, you're hitting this knee point, the bend. And now the gain is lessened. So that 60 input is an output of 110. Well, 110 minus 60 is 50. So now my gain is only 50. And 70 in is an output of 110. Well, now my gain's only 40. And 80 in is an output of 110. Okay, so from now, nothing's changing. 90 input is an output of 110. So there's really nothing, I'm getting just completely a blockage of increased output. But if I increased my maximum power output adjustment to be here, okay, then with 40 dB inputs, my output here is about 107. 40 in, 107 out. What's the difference? 67. We're talking if we did this. And 50 in is an output of about 117. Still, my gain is 67. See what I'm saying? Only when you start to get around 60 in, now you're hitting the knee point, the crunch. So now 60 in is about 127 out. And 70 in is about 127 out. And 80 in is about 120. So my gain is going down, 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 because the differences between my input and my output are becoming less and less and less. So this hearing aid is now holding the output to be about 127, whereas here it held the output to be about 110. And how did we choose which MPO we wanted? You looked at the uncomfortable loudness level of the client. Okay, say it was around 100 dBHL, and you should add about 10 to 15 to that, because the difference between HL and SPL for the speech frequencies is around of an average of 10 to 15. So if the guy's UCL, or loudness discomfort level under headphones, in a test booth is around 100 dBHL, you should make your UCL or your MPO around 115. Okay, it's just a general rule of thumb, something we may or may not have mentioned in prior Zoom sessions, but nonetheless. So, looking at all of this is all review from last week. Linear gain is always shown as a 45-degree angle because my increases to input and increases to output are at a 1-to-1 ratio. Back to your notes here. Page 2. In all hearing aid specs, there are two kinds of graphs: frequency responses and input-output functions. Older hearing aids provided only linear gain. Hey, Angela, how's it going? Yeah, I haven't missed too much. We've been mostly reviewing, but I will highly advise or recommend that if you're just coming on now, to be at the end of the Zoom session to watch the earlier first 10 minutes of this Zoom session, okay? Because we did cover a bit of stuff, but I think it's kind of good if you did that. Just a word for anybody joining on now, it would be really good to make sure you're looking at this Zoom session from A to Z, or as we say in Canada, A to Z. Anyway, same gain for all input levels, that's linear gain. Please remember, it's not the same gain for all hearing aids. You could have weaker or stronger linear hearing aids. Linear just means the same gain for all inputs. So if the linear hearing aid gave 50 dB of gain, it gave 50 dB of gain to a 10 dB input, and it gave dB SPL input, and it gave 50 dB of gain to a 20 dB SPL input, and the same amount of gain to a 30 dB SPL input. And we said last week, you could visually tell wearers of linear gain hearing aids because they were constantly changing the volume controls on their hearing aids. If the gain was set right for average conversational inputs like speech, like 65 dB SPL, average my father can beat your father at checkers, yakety yakety yak, your mother wears army boots, blah, blah, blah. Okay, if the gain was perfect for average conversational speech inputs, that gain might be great for average, but for a whisper, it wasn't enough. And so the guy had to crank it up. And then for loud inputs, suddenly it went into peak clipping and it sounded horrible. So the guy was turning it down. So compression meant different gains for different inputs. So compression means that it's not the same gain for all inputs. Therefore, volume controls are relied upon less. And if you've seen any clinic with receiver and canal hearing aids today, which are all compression, you'll barely even find a volume control. You might find a volume control on the user's handheld remote, but those volume controls are not as necessary as they used to be with linear gain hearing aids, because compression automatically, in fact, an old word for compression is AGC, automatic gain control. That's actually an old acronym for compression, AGC, and it just means different gains for different inputs. You're getting different amounts automatically. The hearing aid is doing this automatically. So if I share screen and give you an example of, let's say, a compression hearing aid, we can do that if we tell about this set of lies here. Let's see. Why don't we go to, let's go to this guy, right? No, not those. Those suck. Here. Here you go. Here's a compression hearing aid. And you can see you're getting linear gain. The line is 45-degree angle for all inputs from 0 up to 60. The gain is identical. In this case, 0 in, 60 out, 20 in, 80 out, 40 in, 100 out, 60 in, 120 out. The gain is always 60. And now you're in compression. So instead of hard peak clipping, okay, and Angela, I added this line because I was giving an example earlier. This never used to be on this PowerPoint slide. I added it on to make a point, so that's why. So, but at any rate, here's linear peak clipping, linear peak clipping. Here's compression. So that 80 in, yeah, my output also increased a little bit, but my input went up by 20, but my output didn't increase by 20. Maybe my output only increased by, say, 5. So if my input increased by 20 and my output only went up by 5, that's a 20 to 5 compression ratio. And 20 over 5 is equal to X over 1. Here. And what's X? Well, 1 times 20 is 20, divided by 5, I guess is going to be 4. That's a 4-to-1 compression ratio. Okay? You always boil down compression ratios to 1. So a 20 to 5 compression ratio is true. That is true. Numerically, it's accurate, but you always want to boil it down to 1. And so a 1-to-1 compression ratio is a good old 45-degree angle line, meaning as inputs increase by 20, my outputs increase by 20. But here at the red, you can see in this example, my input went up by 20, but my output went up by only, say, 5. Because here, I'm only at about 125. Dig good. Well, all righty. Okay, so hearing aid specs. Let's look at, again, here's old analog hearing aid, but you'll see this on digital too. You can cut out the highs. You can cut out the lows. Frequency responses are very friendly controls to read. Here's a typical spec sheet from a hearing aid called some hearing aid, okay, from a hearing aid company. And here they gave the saturation output curve. There's that bass control. Here's that treble. So these three I'm showing you are actually this, okay? Those three I'm just showing you close up. That's here. And then you'll see this control highlighted over here. And we described that earlier. So on specs, you're going to see both kinds of graphs. Frequency responses, input-output curves. Okay? And that's why I'm drawing this to your attention here. Compression came into existence as soon as technology allowed it. Compression came into existence in the 1980s, but barely anybody used it. Most people didn't know how to use it. They used linear gain anyway, but the need for compression is based on this graph. This graph is because of outer hair cell damage. Looky, looky, here comes Cookie. Okay, watch. My inputs all the way up to 100 dB. How loud are they perceived? This is perception, this is physics. So to normal, here's normal. Here's a normal hearing person. 10 or 20 dB is heard as very soft. 30 to 40 is heard as soft. 50 or 60 is heard as comfortable. 70 or 80 is heard as loud, and 100 is heard as too loud. When you've got hair cell damage, you've got the blue line. Now 50 or 60 is soft, and yet 100 sounds too loud. And so the person's dynamic range has gotten smaller. His floor to ceiling no longer spans 100 dB. Now his floor has risen up to 50, and his ceiling is still 100. And so this guy's going to need soft sounds amplified by a lot and loud sounds amplified by little or nothing at all. Hence the need and desire for the use of compression. And when they just didn't have the technology, all they had was linear. Then compression came into the picture. And that's part of what this course is for, is to introduce you to the concept of compression. Here's a guy's hearing loss in dBHL. Okay, and here's minimal audible pressure. This is in SPL. This axis is in SPL, and you can see this blue curve here is actually 0 dBHL. Please remember that from acoustics. This is minimal audible pressure. The softest it takes to hear all the different frequencies with one ear under a headphone. Okay, but look what happens with hair cell damage. Now his floor becomes elevated, but his ceiling of loudness tolerance didn't. So this picture and this picture are showing the very same thing. The only thing this picture is including is all different frequencies, whereas this picture here could be at any frequency. It's likely one of the high frequencies, like somewhere between 2,000 to 4,000 hertz, okay? The floor has become elevated to around 50, and the ceiling is limited at about 100. So this guy's dynamic range, his floor to ceiling, has become narrower than the normal one. And the most common type of compression used today is called wide dynamic range compression, WDRC. And that is used in order to make these white arrows happen, amplifying soft sounds by a lot and loud sounds by little or nothing at all. Why? Because the sensory neural loss person has no problem with sound getting to the cochlea. He doesn't have a conductive hearing loss. He doesn't have a plug in the ear. Okay? He doesn't have otitis media. He doesn't want all sounds louder. He just wants soft sounds louder. But loud sounds, he hears them just as loudly as anyone else. So he wants the hearing aid to offer very different amounts of gain automatically without changing the volume control all the time. Hence, WDRC compression. Same picture is shown here. A normal dynamic range is large. When you've got a reduced dynamic range, it's the floor that has risen. The ceiling of loudness tolerance has not changed an iota. Same here. Here's a picture of a normal hearing person, UCL on the bottom, MCL in the middle. Here's a person with moderate sensory neural loss. His thresholds are increased, but his UCL is largely the same. So this uncomfortable loudness level and the left uncomfortable loudness level are meant to give you this impression where these lines meet right here. And that's called recruitment. Recruitment means the person with sensory neural loss hears loud sounds just as loudly as a person with normal hearing. Okay? Hence the need for compression. Same picture here, and I think this is the last one in this particular first set of the unit here. Here's a soft input, 5 dB. Here's the guy's thresholds. This guy would want 5 decibel inputs to be amplified by the full degree of his loss, because now he can hear it, right? So all this 5 dB across the frequencies was not audible. It was below his thresholds. Meanwhile, it's up on top, but that's the stupid audiogram for you. That's why we call the audiogram ODD IOGRAM. Okay, it's the only graph where more goes down, but you know what I mean. Okay, stick with me here. All right. So when you're looking here, soft inputs like 5 dB, sure, amplify them by the full degree of his loss. But average inputs, here's an input of 60. It's barely audible to the guy. So you want to amplify it too, but by less. And a loud sound of 90, I'm not going to want to amplify that by hardly anything at all. So the green to the yellow to the red, okay, you can see that the distance becomes smaller and smaller. This is talking about, these things are talking about the amount of amplification you want to do, the amount of amplification you want to do, the amount of amplification you want. And it's highlighting exactly back to this picture here. The arrows get shorter and shorter as the inputs increase, and increase. It's a very important concept because it not only deals with the need for compression, but this is also the basis of all hearing aid fitting methods. If you took 150 this summer, you will remember the half gain rule. And the half gain rule said, the yellow, look at the yellow, that's the half gain rule. Look at it, it's only 25. The distance between 60 and 85 is 25. You want to amplify average inputs by half the degree of the loss. The guy's loss is 50. I don't want to amplify average inputs by 50, or I'm going to set the output way down here. It's going to be too much. So I want half gain for average inputs. I would want more than half gain for soft inputs, and I want less than half gain for loud inputs. Okay, that was the basis of all hearing aid fitting methods, whether it was Nal, Berger, Pogo, any of them. Okay, that's what they wanted. So it's very important to understand this concept that the dynamic range has become less. That's fitting methods address it, and also compression addresses it. And it's an extremely important concept for a clinician to understand. Sensory neural loss with its reduced dynamic range plus linear hearing aids of the day gave us the half gain fitting method. And the half gain fitting method is still the spinal cord of all fitting methods used today. Fitting methods used today, however, will have 3 different targets. They'll have a target suggesting more than half gain for soft inputs, and they'll have a third target suggesting less than half gain for loud inputs. But the targets for average inputs will be largely about half gain. So that's the end of that particular story. Now I'm going to move on to, let's get some practice reading input-output functions. Let's check this out. So go to the other notes under Unit 1. Practice reading input-output functions. And these are questions from the chapter 7 of my little book, Compression for Clinicians. And read what it says here very carefully, 205 to 208. Anyone who hasn't read that, we will take you outside, you will be shot. Okay, very important to read the requested instructions. All right, here we go. Read 205 to 208, a word about input-output functions. Unfortunately, when you read it, you're going to hear my voice. It sucks to be you. Well, that's just the way it is, because I wrote that book and I was talking out loud. Compression, input-output functions are the language of compression. Compression is a gain issue. It addresses the first purpose of hearing aids, providing gain for hearing loss. It does not affect the signal-to-noise ratio, which is the second purpose of all hearing aids. Remember, hearing aids have a twofold task. Remember, 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 remember. Okay? They have to provide hearing gain for the hearing loss, and I call that the D-U-H principle, like duh. But they also have to help separate speech from background noise. Okay, remember why. When looking at your PowerPoint slides and looking at the first PowerPoint that I could have showed you, when I went way up here and we looked at what happened with hearing aids. And you will read the second slide, the fourth slide of the first PowerPoint. Hearing aids have to provide gain for the hearing loss and increase the signal-to-noise ratio. Very important. And the knowledge as to why is because when you lose hair cells, your traveling waves look rounded. That's why. Okay? You don't have the sharpening that's taking place due to the outer hair cells. That sharpening is gone. So this guy cannot separate speech from background noise as well. Why? Look at all the frequencies stimulated by this bump. A whole bunch. If you put a 1,000 hertz tone in the guy's ear, the guy might have hair cells from 1,199 to 1,198 to 1,097 to 1,090. If you know what I mean, you've got a whole spread. Okay? Whereas when you've got normal outer hair cells, you have a sharpened traveling wave so that only the hair cells at 1,000 hertz are stimulated and not the other ones beside. That's why this guy can't separate frequencies close together. He can't distinguish speech from background noise, even with his hearing aids. So that is why it is very important that a hearing aid seeks to not only provide gain, but also to increase the signal-to-noise ratio. Somehow decrease the gain for background noise compared to the speech. When you've increased the signal-to-noise ratio, then the person with the damaged cochlea and the rounded traveling waves, then that person here can, C-A-N, can separate speech from background noise because his hearing aid has deliberately made the speech louder than the background noise. Very important concept to grasp. So now let's go and look at our practices here, and we're going to go to the very first slide of 18. Okay, one of 18. And you're going to look at a picture here that's describing 4 different hearing aids. The one on the left is linear gain. And again, I've made the gain 60. It could have been 43. I just chose 60 because I felt like it. Okay? And here's an output limiting compression, and here's an output limiting compression, and here's a wide dynamic range compression hearing aid. Now, in each of these columns, you're going to see 3 little columns. You're going to see input, output, gain. Input plus gain is output. Input plus gain is output. Gain in this third column is the difference between inputs and outputs. Always remember that, okay? And then at 60, I put an asterisk here, meaning that's where the knee point was. And then the linear gain hearing aid said no more than 120 can come out. No more, no more, no more. And you can see the gain, therefore, is going down, down, down. Output limiting compression was the first type of compression invented. It was meant to imitate linear gain hearing aids, but without using peak clipping. So here, this hearing aid gave a little bit. In other words, here's the knee point again at 60, okay, right here, 60, and at 70, the outputs didn't stay held at 120. The output gave a little bit. And as the input went from 70 to 80, the output only went up by 1. And as the input went up by another 10, the output only went up by 1. And as the input went up by another 10, the output only went up by 1. What's the compression ratio here? 10 to 1. Okay, there you go. Because as my inputs increased by 10, my outputs only increased by 1. Look at the gold-colored column. Here you've got a 20 to 1 compression ratio, because as my inputs went from 60 to 70, my output only went up by half a dB. And as my inputs increased by another 10, my outputs increased by only a half a dB. So now you got a 20 to 1 compression ratio. And look at the blue column. Only 2 to 1. Watch this. This is cool. The knee point's at 40 here. Okay? As my input went to 50, my output also went up, and it went up by 5. So my input went up by 10. My output went up by 5. My input went up by another 10. My output went up by 5. My input went up by another 10. My output went up by another 5. So it's a 10 to 5 ratio. Well, 10 over 5 is equal to 2 over 1. So that's a 2 to 1 compression ratio. And next week, we'll be talking more about this. Next week, we'll be talking about the differences between two main branches of compression. Output limiting compression on the one hand, and WDRC, wide dynamic range compression, on the other hand. One's for severe loss, one's for mild to moderate loss. One's for inner hair cell damage, one's for outer hair cell damage. And we'll cover that. But at any rate, let's move to the next slide and get some questions answered here. Let's play. Let's look at this. Here's the slide number 2. From the textbook, questions 4 to 6 at the end of chapter 7. Question number 4. A compression hearing aid provides 90 dB SPL output with 40 dB SPL input. What's the gain here? Okay, the gain would be 50. If you got a 90 dB SPL output with a 40 dB SPL input, the difference between 90 and 40 is 50. That's the gain. Same hearing aid now. We'll put the knee point at 50, compression ratio of 2 to 1. What's the output for a 60 dB SPL input? Well, let's look at a picture of it. Here you go. Just instead of talking words, let's look at a picture. So we've put the knee point at 50, just like we said in question 5. Knee point is at 50, and the compression ratio, we said, is 2 to 1. So let's draw that. Compression ratio here is 2 to 1. So let's talk turkey. 0 in, 50 out. Gain must be 50. 10 in, 60 out. Gain is 50. 20 in, 70 out. Gain is 50. 30 in, 80 out. Gain is 50. 40 in, 90 out. Gain is 50. Hey, deja vu. 40 out, or 40 dB output with 40 dB input. What's the gain here? 50. Okay, so 40 in, 90 out. My gain is 50. Now let's take question 5. Let's put the knee point at 50. Question 5, knee point at 50, and draw a compression ratio of 2 to 1. All right, having done that, here we go. So 50 in, 100 out. My gain is 50. So everything along here is linear gain, 1 to 1. Because as my inputs increase by 10, my outputs increase by 10. And that happens for everything up to 50. Once you get past 50, the proverbial crap hits the fan. Because now my input went up by 10, What did my output go up by? 5. Yeah. Okay, so with 60 in, my output is 105. And with 70 in, my output's 110. And with 80 input, my output's 115. And 90 input, my output's 120. So as my inputs from past the knee point to the right of the knee point, as my inputs increase by 10, my outputs are correspondingly increasing by only 5. That's a 10 to 5 compression ratio, or boiling it down, 2 to 1. Good. This is very important. The same hearing aid, knee point at 50, compression ratio of 2 to 1, the gain for a 60 dB input, the gain. Let's look at question 6, okay? So you're talking out 60 in, what's my output? 105. So what's the gain? If 60 is coming in and 55. 105 is coming out, what's the difference?
55.
35. 60 in, 105. Yeah, what is the difference? I can't even add. 105 minus 60? I guess you're right. It's 55. You're right. Plus, no, it can't be. No. 50. 45. It's 45. Okay? So my gain is no longer 50 like it was for all of these inputs. Now it's 45. Let's go to 70. If 70 is coming in, 110 is coming out. What's my gain now? 40. Good. If 80 is coming in, 115 is coming out. What's my gain now? 35. So now my gain is down, down, down. If 90 is coming in, 120 is coming out. What's my gain now? 30. Good. And that's what we're talking about in the first slide here. Look at this. 35, 30, 25, 20. And this is like the little old lady in front of you going down the street, and she puts her foot on the brake halfway down the street, hundreds of feet before the stop sign, pissing off everyone else behind her. This is a hearing aid that slows down gradually. It has a weak degree of compression over a wide range of inputs. Wide dynamic range compression. It's meant for mild to moderate sensory neural loss. It's meant for probably 85% of the clients you're going to deal with. They've got a mild to moderate presbycusis. They don't have a severe hearing loss. They've got about a 50 or 60 dB hearing loss. Their dynamic range is about half of normal. So they need a hearing aid that gradually puts on the brakes. WDRC compression. And that is exactly what this blue is showing you here, and what the next picture is showing you here. This is a typical type of compression for mild to moderate hearing loss. A weak degree of compression used. And look at the picture I'm drawing you here. This is a table made from this. Okay, so if you follow 50 in, 100 out, what's the gain? 50 in, 100 out, 50. Because all these are underlined here because this is showing you where the compression has begun. All of these are just showing you where the gain was linear. For 0 inputs all the way up to 50 inputs, the gain was linear. Look at this, the gain was 50, 50, 50, 50, and 50. All I'm doing is making a table describing this picture here. My gain for 0 in was 50 because my output was 50. 10 in, 60 out, my gain is 50. 20 in, 70 out, my gain is 50. 30 in, 80 out, my gain is 50. 40 in, 90 out, my gain is 50. And that's precisely what I'm showing you here. Okay? But once you hit the knee point, 60 in is 105 out. That's a gain of 45. 70 in is 110 out. That's a gain of 40. 80 in is 115 out. That's a gain of 35. So you can see how the outputs are. The gain is gradually going down. It is a weak degree. Compression ratio is 2 to 1, and the knee point was set at around 50, and that's a common situation for mild to moderate hearing losses. This is a type of compression used. It's very, very common. Now, if you go to questions 7 to 9 at the end of chapter 7, we'll take a look at the opposite type of compression. Totally, okay? Look at this, look at question 7. We're going to look at a different kettle of fish here, and then we'll call it a day, okay? Here we go. Yeah, Angela, you were asking if we had the Zoom session on Wednesday. Wasn't sure. Maybe I erroneously gave that. Maybe I wrote that down wrong. I don't know. But I kind of thought to myself, no, I'm probably going to be gabbing away to you today. But nonetheless, who cares? Okay, so question 7. A compression hearing aid provides 120 dB SPL output with 50 dB SPL input. What's the gain? It's always the difference between input and output. What's the gain?
70?
70, correct. Okay, great. So the same hearing aid, knee points at 70 now. Compression ratio is 10 to 1. And let's look at what the output is for an 80 dB SPL input. So here you go. Here's the hearing aid providing 70 dB of gain. 0 in, 70 out. 10 in, 80 out. 20 in, 90 out. 30 in, 100 out. The gain is 70, 70, 70, 70, constantly. 40 in, 110 out. 50 in, 120 out. Look at this. Oh my God. 70 in is 140 out. Yikes! No hearing aid is doing this. I'm just showing you this to give an idea, okay? Just as an example. But now, so here's my knee point. It's set at 70. And look at the compression ratio. Oh my God. So as my input went up by 10, my output went up by 1. Because this is going to be like 120 or 141. See what I'm saying? So you've got and then 90 in, maybe 142. You see what I'm saying? It's like, yeah. So I've got a high knee point, because it's not down at 50, it's up at 70 or whatever, and a high compression ratio. So this hearing aid is like the kid in his dad's car, and he sees the stop sign down the road, and he's speeding away, and suddenly, just before the stop sign, he slams on the brakes. Okay? This hearing aid is usually high power. It's meant for severe hearing loss, and your main concern is to limit that MPO with a lot of compression, because you don't want to cause more hearing loss. So your big concern here is the ceiling. You're really worried about. So you're not going to provide ugly old peak clipping, because that's like me jumping up and down on the bed and slamming my head on a cement wall. You're going to put a bit of sponge on that cement ceiling, so that when I slam my head, it's kind of grr, grr, grr. It's a little bit of a give, but not much. So you're providing a lot of compression at a high knee point. So let's look at the picture here and see what it says. Here's our graph, okay? So if you're talking over here, we'll go to this slide, same hearing aid, knee points at 70, knee points at 70, and compression ratio is 10 to 1. Compression ratio is 10 to 1. The output, read carefully, the output for an 80 dB SPL input is, and let's go to the next picture, 80 in. What's my output? About 141. What's the gain there then? Okay, so let's look at our table here. And for a 90 dB input, my output's only 142. And for a 100 dB SPL input, my output's 143. So when you're looking at the table that would go with this graph, the table that goes with this, okay, now you're looking at 0 input, output of 70, my gain is 70. 10 in, output of 80, my gain is 70. 20 in, output of 90, my gain is 70. So you're looking at linear gain, all linear gain, 1-to-1 as my inputs go up by 10, my outputs go up by 10, okay? And you're showing that here. The line is 45-degree angle. It's tit for tat. As my inputs go up by 10, my outputs go up by 10. And that occurs for all these inputs all the way up to 70. So my gain here is linear, 45-degree angle, tit for tat, 1-to-1. And then suddenly, once I get past my knee point, the hearing aid slams on the brakes. And so to answer this question here, compression ratio of 10-to-1, the output for 80 dB SPL input is, well, the output is 141. Okay, now go to question 9. Same hearing aid, knee point at 70, compression ratio of 10-to-1. Now read it carefully. The output for a 90 dB SPL input is?
62.
Well, the output. The output, 90 in, be 142 out. So now let's go to where Roger was going. Let's look at our table. Let's look at the table here. 70 in, 140 out. My gain is 70. Yep, 70 in, 140 out. My gain is 70. But now let's look at 80 in, 141 out. What's the difference? 61. So 80 in, my output is 141. What's 141 minus 80? Well, 141 minus 80 is 61, I guess. And for a 90 dB input, my output was 142. 90 in, my output was 142. So what's the gain there? Well, 142 minus 90, 52. And let's look at the next one. 100 in was 143 out. So 143 out minus 100 in, a gain of 43. So you can see here my gain was 70, 70, 70, and all of a sudden, the brakes put on. Bam, bam, bam. Look at how much the gain is reduced quickly here compared to how the gain is reduced slowly here. You see, wide dynamic range compression is a low knee point and a low compression ratio. Output limiting compression is a high knee point and a high compression ratio. Output limiting compression is put on high power hearing aids for people with severe hearing loss. WDRC compression is low knee point, low ratio, and it's meant for mild to moderate sensory neural loss, where you're not so worried because the hearing aid's weaker. The hearing aid's not providing 70 dB of gain, it's providing like 50. It's a weaker hearing aid, and that would be 50 if you cranked it up. I mean, so you're talking about Mrs. McGillicuddy here, just Mr. Jones. Typical mild to moderate presbycusis. Of the two compressions, WDRC has by far the wider applicability. But in today's digital hearing aids, both are used. WDRC is used for average inputs, and for very loud inputs, the hearing aid automatically goes in output limiting. But we can't go there yet. I want you to understand compression, period, before we move on to how it is implemented in digital hearing aids. But I think we've basically covered what I really wanted to cover today, and I'm going to continue on this more next week. But basically, it's this slide to the beginning. These are the ones that I really want you to have highlighted and look at those internalize them, practice with those. It's really, don't go, this one here is just meant to piss you off, okay? So don't even go there. Just leave that one alone. I'm not going to ask you that question here. What I'm concerned about is these slides here. And it's not like all hearing aids do exactly what these slides are showing. This is just giving you an example of hearing aid X, and here's an example of hearing aid Y, but they're just showing you why an example of output limiting compression, OLC, and an example of WDRC compression, wide dynamic range compression. Next week, we'll go more into some of the remaining slides in here, and I can kind of talk a little bit about these slides here, and we'll highlight some of this stuff. It's not going to be rocket science. It's not going beyond, but it's basically showing you a little bit more about reading input-output functions. Just to give you an example here. Here, look, I have a picture. Okay? 50 input, 60 input, 70 input, okay? If my output for a 50 input was 90, my gain was 40. If an output for a 60 input was 95, my gain was 35. If my output for a 70 dB input was 100, then my gain is 30. Okay, so which line below, though, represents most gain? This one, or this one? And that would be a quiz question. And you should be telling me this one.
First one.
The leftmost line, if you're moving it this way, always represents more gain. Always, always, always. Look, if I need 50 input to give me 90 output, my gain is 40. But look at the rightmost one here. Look at this line here. Okay? And how much do I have to, if I'm looking at this line here, where am I going to meet 90 output? There. So I'm going to need 63 maybe, to give me a 90 output. That's less than 40. Okay, look at again. Here's this line here, and look at its knee point. If 50 in is 90 out, my gain is 40. So now let's look at the rightmost blue line. Where does it meet 90? Keep going, keep going, keep going, right here. So if I work my way down, that's like almost 65. It's like 63 input is required to give me 90 output. 90 minus 63 is less than 30. Okay? Let the graph tell the story. Let the Zen Buddhism settle in. Take a chill pill. Always let the graph talk to you. Even though it's not like you completely understand it, who cares? Neither do I. The graph. Just follow the graph and let it talk to you. Smoke a hoochie? No, I mean, well, you can't do that in Missouri yet. But you know what I mean. Okay, you will. It's soon. Anyway, I'm done for now, 2:40. Next week, we will finish the slides in this PowerPoint, and then we'll move on to Unit 2, Output Limiting and WDRC. So be sure to have your notes printed up for Unit 2. And Unit 2 is called OLC versus WDRC. And we'll talk more about the clinical applications of each one. But you're learning a lot. You guys are learning compression way better than the typical IHS grad is doing in their distance online. You can rest assured of that. You are learning compression the way audiology students at Missouri State University in Springfield are learning compression. They probably are using the same textbook. Okay, so I'm telling you, I'm squeezing in audiology here. I'm shoehorning it in, but I'm doing that on purpose because I want OTC grads to be a cut above. I desperately want that, so that when people hire you, they go, holy shit, how did you know that? Good. That's exactly what I want. Then like an old salmon, I can swim up the stream to die. Know what I mean? All right. Adios, amigos. That's it for me today. It's time for a beer. All right. See you later.